Continuing on with our mixing series, let's take a listen to the bass to hear what we're working with. As you can hear, it's just a basic DI on the way in. Here we are actually using 5-string, which is my own virtual bass instrument I made with Linux Sampler. What's great about it is because it's a DI with practically no processing, it's very versatile. You can essentially make it whatever you need it to be with just a little bit of processing. So for this track, I don't want anything special from the bass. All I want it to do is to be a nice round sound, which once it's in the context of the mix will give us a nice anchored low end, which blends well with the lows of the percussion instruments. Let's take a listen to what we've set up here with THU. We're coming in with a fairly low signal into THU. This will simply have the effect of not driving the amp as hard, so for the time being we will retain a very clean bass sound. We're also using the Slate Bass Classic, so I'll go through the settings for that now. Whenever I'm dealing with a DI'd bass, I do like to use this type of setup where what we have is we have the splitter. On one side of that splitter, we are processing the DI with an amplifier, and on the other side, with the parallel channel, we're just using a basic EQ so that we can have control over the dry DI sound. This is really helpful for when you are dealing with more crazy bass effects. So say for instance, you're mixing a track for a hard rock style and what you want is a very edgy bass. Well, what you might want to do is you might want to go in, get some of that nice amp tonality first, but then use the really pristine top end of the DI'd bass to bring in a sense of edginess to the overall tonality. Now in this example, we're blending the two and we're not actually doing anything with the EQ. Here I wanted to mention the importance of checking the phase, because what we're essentially doing is duplicating the sound and then processing those two sounds in parallel and modulating them to be slightly different to one another, and then you're bringing those two back together. It's very important to check the phase, especially with any instrument which has a lot of bass, because the waveforms in the low end are much longer and you can accidentally lose all of the bass information if you have phasing issues. Now take a listen to what happens when I flip the polarity when we blend these two basses back together. So it's absolutely night and day. You can hear it was crying out for the polarity to be switched. It's just something to be aware of when you're using this type of technique in your mixes. And this is the area where we can blend between the DI and the amp sound. So basically when the fader is down, you get more DI, and when it is up, you get more amp sound. For this mix, I left it in the middle, but as you'll hear soon, in this example, it didn't really matter how I blended the two. I just wanted to share this method of having good control over your amp and DI blend, because it can be really helpful in other scenarios. For instance, like the making an edgy bass sound example that I gave you earlier. Now this EQ is kind of why it didn't matter too much what I did with the blend between the DI and the bass. What we're about to do is we're going to completely take away all of the top end of our bass and only leave the lows, which will help the bass anchor in our mix. We could have just done this with the DI, but the amp will add some subtle thickening which will help, and also the impulse response will give us a nice tonal shaping in the lows. So why are we taking away the top end of our bass? Well, firstly, for this mix type, it wasn't important. Now, a lot of rock and metal mixes will like that detail in the top end, but for this instance, we have the attack of the strums, the bow sound of the violin, so adding the attack of the bass plucks into this would have probably been too much and also wouldn't have suited stylistically. There is another reason. To get the bass really present and anchored in the lows, we have a little trick we're going to use in a moment, but first, before I show you that, let's take a listen to what this EQ is doing. As you can hear, all of that top end spikiness is gone now, and all we have left are those rounded lows. Now, one problem that we have is that with the sound being so simplified, anyone playing this on small speakers will either lose a lot of presence of the bass or completely lose all of the bass, which brings me to the next few steps. We've added the VCC, and as you just seen, we are driving it into the red using the Brit 4KE console sim. This is the start of the layering saturation process, which is going to add newly generated harmonics into the low mids and mids. And as we do this, the bass will regain a lot of presence and will retain a nice rounded sound. Here we're heading into the FG stress where we're getting some mild compression using a slightly tweaked presets. Then we're heading into the custom opto where we're getting more of a reaction as both of these compressors work towards helping us anchor this bass guitar in our mix. The compression these tools are adding is important, but for me the most important thing is that these processors are adding even more saturation which will thicken up the bass further. Now, talking about saturation, let's throw on the secret sauce to fat bass. For the final stage of processing, we're using the virtual tape machine. Here, we are driving the input so it pins the needle on the VU meter. This is going to generate a lot of new harmonics, which will help the bass be heard on smaller speakers and will also sound great on listening systems with an extended low range. Let's take a listen to the change it's making. So as you can hear, a really big change. Now in solo, it might not sound that great right now, or you might not even be a fan of the way it sounds, period. But let me tell you, I've listened to the final master of this track on monitors, on earbuds, on headphones. I've listened in the car, and I've listened to it on old iPad speakers. On everything, the bass is present, but not overbearing and bloated. And the reason for that is all of the saturation we've added makes the bass very competitive in the mix. You put this together with the fact that later on what we're going to be doing is we're going to be keeping the lows fairly clear of anything that isn't a bass or a low-pitched percussion. So you ultimately get a very well-defined low end, which you can balance easily with the mid-range and top. Let's finish off by doing an A-B of all the processes in solo, and then we'll listen in context with the mix as well. Funnily enough, I've heard blown out speakers on bass amps which actually sounds similar to this, but the truth is, in the context of the mix, all of those added harmonics serve us really well, and the bass sounds cleaner than it actually is in the context of the mix. So I think the lesson here is don't worry about how things sound in solo. What's most important is the effect that they're having actually in the context of the mix. Thanks for watching. We'll be processing the rhythm stem next in keeping with the top-down method we're using here. Hope to see you there. I'll catch you next time.